Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time. This is Masechet Bava Kamma, and this is our 11th class in this Masechet. We are nearing the end, probably about another month or so. So get ready. But kol hakavod, this week we are going to be reviewing Daf 70 through 76. And we are continuing to discuss things that were stolen, a person who stole things, and what their liability is. So the Mishnah on Daf 70 tells us that if a person stole and there were two witnesses, again, in Jewish law, in order to be brought to court, there need to have been two witnesses. So if a person stole something and there were two witnesses, and then either sold it or slaughtered the animal with the same two witnesses or a new set of witnesses, so then the person has to pay 4 or 5 times the value of the animal. The assumption here is that the Torah tells us that if a person sold a sheep or stole and then slaughtered or sold a sheep, he has to pay 4 times the value. And if it's an ox, then it's 5 times the value. The Torah sees that either you sold it or you slaughtered it as the same action, and therefore you would be liable 4 or 5 times. So for the rest of this class, I'll either say the word stole or slaughtered, but it's either one, right? They're interchangeable. The penalty is the same, meaning you stole the animal and then you did another action. Either you sold that animal or you slaughtered that animal. Okay, so here we have two witnesses that testify to the theft, and either the same witnesses or new witnesses that testify to the sale or the slaughter. Okay, if he sold it on Shabbat or sold it for idolatry, again, I'm using the word sold, but it could also be slaughtered for, or he slaughtered it on Yom Kippur, or he stole it from his father and then slaughtered it, and then the father died, or he stole it and then he slaughtered it and then he sanctified it. In all of these cases, you are still liable to pay 4 or 5 times the value. We'll see at the end of this class today where we're going to construct a case where you will not be liable for the 4 or the 5. But in all of these cases, because the Gemara will go through each case, the person is still liable for 4 or 5 times. If the person stole the animal and slaughtered it for medicinal purposes, or to give it to the dogs, or it turns out that it was not a kosher animal, you still pay 4 or 5 times. Or another opinion is that you are exempt. The Gemara now tells us on Daf 70 that Rabbi Akiva says that you have to establish the whole process with 2 witnesses and not 2 sets of witnesses, meaning you need to have the same witnesses who say that the person stole and then that the person sold the item. Our Mishnah, however, says you could have 2 sets. A person needs to prove that he had. So this is a little bit of an aside, but we'll see the connection. A person who wants to prove that a certain field is his, and he has to show that he has owned it for 3 years. Let's say he doesn't have the contract anymore, so he has to show that it's been his for 3 years. He can have 3 sets of witnesses that testify, 1 for each year. So this shows that the 3 sets combine into 1 testimony. Rabbi Akiva says, no, you need to have the same set of witnesses for all 3 years. Okay. Okay, now we also said in the Mishnah that on Shabbat, if you slaughtered it, so then again, the Mishnah says if you sold it on Shabbat, so then you would be liable to pay 4 or 5. However, if you slaughtered it on Shabbat, you wouldn't pay 4 or 5 because the act of killing an animal on Shabbat transgresses Shabbat, and we know that there's a principle. Again, in Aramaic, the principle is kimle midraba mine, which means that if you're liable for 2 transgressions at the same time, you only get punished for the more severe one, and you do not pay for the less severe one. So if you slaughter this animal on Shabbat, you would be liable for capital punishment because you transgressed the Shabbat, and you would not have to pay the monetary penalty that would also go hand in hand with it. Excuse me. Okay, so now the question is, what happens with a sale? Isn't selling something on Shabbat problematic? So the Gemara says that it has to be that it's at the exact same time, right? The exact same time that he transgressed Shabbat, he sells the item. So how would it be, right? So let's say he says, right, the buyer says to the thief, right, pull the fig from the tree as payment for the stolen item, right? Meaning because the transfer of money is not necessarily a transgression of Shabbat, but pulling a fig from the tree is. So then in that case, there wouldn't be payment because at the exact moment that he's getting his payment, he's also harvesting a fruit, and therefore he wouldn't have to pay because he would be transgressing Shabbat, right? Or maybe the person says, throw your animal into my domain, and then it's the sale and the transgression of Shabbat at the same time. Or maybe not, because as soon as it gets into the airspace, you acquire it. So therefore, it would not be a comparable case. He would have to say, right, I won't acquire it till it lands in my domain. So then, in that case, it would work and it is a sale and the person would not pay 4 or 5 times. Okay, Daf 71 tells us that a person stole, again, the Mishnah told us that a person stole and then slaughtered an animal on Yom Kippur. You pay because the punishment for transgressing Yom Kippur is karet, which means that you get basically the death penalty, but God is going to do it and not a human court. Therefore, there's no kimle because there's no court giving you capital punishment. So therefore, you pay. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute, we know that if you're liable for karet, which is like your soul is going to get like killed eternally, so like you're cut off from the nation of Israel. But if a person is liable for karet, they also get lashes here in this world. And therefore, if you're getting lashes, you shouldn't have to pay. So that seems to be a contradiction to what we just said. Let's say, again, you stole and then you slaughtered on Shabbat. You still pay because someone else slaughtered it for him on Shabbat, right? Maybe he didn't slaughter it himself. And this seems to be an exception. Just like you can sell it through somebody else, so too you can slaughter it through somebody else, meaning a messenger. If he himself slaughters it, so he wouldn't pay 4 or 5 because of kimle, like we said before. But if someone else slaughters it, he would have to pay. Or because it wasn't a valid slaughtering, or if you slaughter it on Shabbat or Yom Kippur, the shchita is valid, even though it is forbidden to do on Shabbat. Okay, so now the Gemara talks about slaughtering it for idolatry. If you slaughter the animal for idolatry, it becomes forbidden to get any benefit from that animal right away when he completes the shchita, the slaughter, and not the owner's animal, right? Meaning it now becomes forbidden to get any benefit from it. So the Gemara says no, and this is important to understand, that the slaughtering process is a process, right? To have a kosher shchita, that's slaughtering in Hebrew, a kosher shchita is when you cut through both the esophagus and the trachea, right? The windpipe and the esophagus. You need to cut through both of them to be a kosher shchita. So now the Gemara talks about when is it considered shchita? When you first start it or when you finish it, even though obviously the process takes a second, maybe 2 seconds, but it still is a process, something that has a beginning and an end. So the Gemara says that as long as you say that it's for idolatry at the end of the shchita process, so then you are saying that at the same time that you slaughtered it, it becomes forbidden because of idolatry. So too with the ox that is going to be stoned, right? The shor haniskal. We mentioned this is the case of the ox that kills a person. He needs to be stoned, and you're not allowed to get any benefit from this ox. Sorry, 1 minute. Okay. All right. We mentioned that if the father died after the person slaughtered the animal, so then you do pay 4 or 5 times. Because now, again, when the father dies, that person gets the inheritance of that animal. But if he slaughtered it beforehand, so then he needed to pay before the father died. Let's say a person stole something from 2 partners and admitted to one of the partners, so then he doesn't need to pay the other partner, meaning let's say he owes them, right, half and half. If he admits to one, he does not have to pay the other. Now, I think we've seen this before, but it's important to recognize that, excuse me, if you admit to a crime, you do not pay the penalty. You do pay the principal, the value of the item, but you do not pay the penalty. The reason for this is to encourage people to admit when they do something wrong, right? You get back your item or they pay compensation. But in order to incentivize people to come forward, they do not have to pay the penalty. Sorry. Okay, so now the Gemara says, wait a minute. In our case with the father who dies, so when the father dies, the person becomes the heir to the estate, and he doesn't need to pay himself. So you would think that because he doesn't have to pay himself, now he doesn't have to pay the estate, meaning his other brothers. But we said he still needs to pay 4 or 5 to his brothers. So how does that work? So the Gemara explains it's only after there was a verdict in the court before the father died, meaning he already owed the estate the money before the father died. Therefore, he still has to pay the estate, i.e. the brothers. If the father died and then he slaughtered the animal, he does not pay 4 or 5 times. And that's going to be in the next Mishnah that we're going to see soon. If the father didn't bring him to court before he died, he also doesn't pay because there hasn't been a court case yet. Or maybe he does pay half of the 4 or 5 to the other partner, meaning to the brothers, right? His portion he doesn't have to pay, but the other portions he does. Daf 72 tells us that when he slaughters the animal, when the father is still alive, it's done it's a prohibition if he does it, and that's why he pays. If he does it after the father dies, it's a partial transgression because some of it is his animal. He's allowed to slaughter his own animal. Therefore, he doesn't pay the 4 or 5 times if it happens after the father died, right? Again, let's say, now a new case. If he slaughters the animal, a stolen animal, in the temple, right? He does it in the temple, so he pays 4 or 5 times. This shows that, again, we talked about the shchita process, that it's only considered shchita at the end of the process and not when he starts. Because if that was the case, he would not be liable in this case, right? Or maybe you're only liable for the beginning, right? The small part of the beginning. Or maybe he started the actual slaughtering outside of the temple and then he finished it in the temple. Therefore, at the same time that he's liable for slaughtering the animal, he's also liable for stealing. Okay, our next Mishnah tells us that, and this is going to be an exact parallel to the last Mishnah, if you stole an animal and then you sold it with the same set, oh no, sorry, we're not up to the parallel case yet. This is a new idea. If you stole an animal and then sold it with the same set of witnesses, and then it turns out that these witnesses become edim zomemim. Okay, I'm not sure if we've learned this concept before. Edim zomemim means witnesses that are proven to have lied, but in a very particular way. We're going to see in a minute, there's 2 ways to contradict a testimony, right? One set of witnesses can come and say, I saw so-and-so kill so-and-so with a gun. And then someone can say, I saw so-and-so kill him with a knife. That is what's called a contradiction. In Hebrew, it's called hakhasha. Hakhasha means it's a contradictory testimony. Okay, that's one type of contradictory testimony. Okay, that's one. The other one is called edim zomemim. I'm not sure if there's a word for that, a translation for that in English, but they are seen as false witnesses in a particular way. The way is that they say, I saw so-and-so kill so-and-so on Sunday, right, at 4 o'clock. And then another set of witnesses come and they say, what are you talking about? On Sunday at 4 o'clock, you guys were with us at the movies. There's no way you saw Bob kill John, in whatever, in Flatbush. You were with us in Manhattan. We were at the movies together. Okay, the Torah says that the second set of witnesses says, Imanu hayitem, you were with us. You were with us, therefore there's no way you could have seen what happened. Okay, if that happens, they're called edim zomemim, and this is, that's nice, Zohar says scheming witnesses, I like that. These witnesses now get the punishment of whatever they were trying to get the other person convicted of. right? So if this is the death penalty, so then they get sentenced to death. Now, there are a lot of variables, and we'll learn it later on in Masechet Sanhedrin and in Masechet Makot, but it's brought up here. So again, it's important to recognize there are two types of disproving witnesses. One is hakhasha, where you just disagree. The other is zomemim, and that means you couldn't possibly know what happened over there because you were with us. Now, in Eidim Zomemim, in that case, their testimony gets thrown out. So now let's go to our Mishnah. Okay, one set of witnesses said, again, Joe stole an animal and then he sold it, right? It's one set of witnesses. Now comes a second set of witnesses and they say, I don't know what you guys are talking about. You were with us on the other side of town. There's no way you could have seen that happened. So then these witnesses are now going to have to pay 4 or 5 times the value. Again, they were trying to get John to pay 4 or 5 times. So now they need to pay 4 or 5 times. If the fact that he sold it was with a separate set of witnesses, and now both of them become Eidim Zomemim. Okay, so we basically have 2 sets of witnesses that, let's start again. We have one set of witnesses that says that the person stole. We have another set of witnesses that say that he sold it after he stole it. Then comes a set of witnesses and says, I don't know what you're talking about. You were with us, when he stole it. And then another set of witnesses comes about the second one and says, how could you say that he sold it? You were with us. Okay. So we just knocked out, right? 2 and 2, we knocked out the testimony. But what's the punishment? The first set who says, I saw him steal, they need to pay double the value, because when you steal, you have to pay double the value. And then the second set who said, we saw him sell it after he stole it, they now need to pay 3 times the value, because 2 and 3 makes 5, and that's what he would have had to have paid if he sold it after he stole it. I hope you got that. But basically, each one pays what they were trying to get the other people to do. If the last set become, again, right? So we have 2 sets of witnesses. The first one says stole. The second one says sold. So if the last set becomes zomemim, so then the thief pays double, because that testimony is still there. So he stole it, so he has to pay double, but he doesn't have to pay 3 more times. The Eidim Zomemim have to pay the extra 3 times. So we split the testimony and we split the punishment. Let's say only one of the 2 witnesses became Zomemim. So then the whole second set becomes invalidated and we knock out that testimony. If one witness from the first set becomes Zomem, then all of the testimony gets knocked out, because again, the first set is the one that says it was stolen. So if we knock out the fact that, again, we have stolen and sold. If we knock out that it was stolen, then we can't have testimony that he sold it. I don't know that it's stolen. And therefore, everything gets knocked out. Okay, that was the Mishnah. Now let's go to the Gemara. So now we have a question. A minute. We have a question. When a witness becomes a zomem witness, meaning he was, kind of knocked out. So the question is, he becomes invalid as a witness. So the question is, does he become invalid retroactively, meaning now I don't believe anything he's ever said? Or do we say from now on he will be invalidated? So again, this is very important to know. How valid this witness really is. Right, again, if it's from now, so then really it's because it's 2 against 2, right? How do you know who to listen to, right? One says one thing, the other says you were with us. Who do we know? How do we know who to listen to, right? It's unique that we listen to the second set. Or no, because you're invalidating. Why would we say that we're not going to invalidate him retroactively? Because then we're invalidating all the contracts that he signed, everything he's been a witness for, and that could be extremely problematic. And here we say that the law is according to Abaye, that it is retroactive, even though it becomes complicated. And here I'll just put it as aside that there are 6 times in the Gemara, in all of Shas, that we go according to Abaye when he is arguing with Rava. There are 6 times where we go according to Abaye, and there's a mnemonic to remember the 6 times. The mnemonic is Ya'el Kegam. Each one of these letters represents another machloket that's in Shas, where in the Gemara, where they argue. And in these 6 cases, we go according to Abaye as opposed to Rava. So that is actually in the Rashi on Daf 73. So you can see there all the examples, but the ayin, Ya'el, the ayin is Edim Zomemim. So that is our case. Okay. Next. On Daf 73, let's say we have one set of witnesses that testifies about a theft and the sale or the slaughtering of the animal. And then we find out that they are zomemim. We said that they pay 4 or 5 times. But if they are invalidated as witnesses retroactively, then they wouldn't be valid for the second testimony. Meaning, again, don't forget, they testified twice. Once that the person stole, and the second time that the person sold or slaughtered the animal. So if you're going to say that it works retroactively, then how are they ever going to have to pay 4 or 5 times? Don't we knock out that second testimony? So the Gemara says, no, they were found to be zomemin for the second testimony, for the fact that he sold it. And then, right, they pay 3 times. Then they're found to be zomemin for the first one. And then they pay 4 or 5 times. And then the Gemara says, actually, the case is that they testified at the same time. It's one testimony. Therefore, you don't split it in half. It stays one testimony. And when they become zomemin for that testimony, they now have to pay 4 or 5 times. If we invalidate part of a testimony, we invalidate the whole testimony. This is a principle in the Gemara that if there are 2 parts of a testimony, so then if one part is invalidated, the other part gets thrown out. There's no such thing as partial testimony, right? If you're lying about half, why would you not lie about the other half? So we throw out the whole thing. Therefore, if they're found out to be zomemim, right, that they lied about the fact that he stole the item, we throw out all of the testimony, not only that he stole, but also that he sold it. But if they were zomemim for the second testimony, the thief pays double, and the edim zomemim pay 2 or 3 times more. right? And this is only if there were two sets of witnesses, right? If it's the same set, we're going to knock it all out. If they're two sets, so then they're not related. So you can keep one and not the other. Okay, so now the Tamara says, wait a minute, what does it mean? Two sets, one set. The way we understood it before is literally two sets mean four people, one set means two people. So the Gemara says, no. Two sets mean that it was still two people, meaning one set of witnesses that testifies two times, and one set means one set of witnesses that testifies at the same time, meaning it's one testimony as opposed to two. If in that case they become zomamin for the shchita, and if only invalid from now, so then the first part of the testimony is still valid. But if we say that it is retroactive, so then it wouldn't work. Okay. We have another principle now, which is, in Hebrew, the principle is, toch kedei dibur, kedibur dami. If I make a statement and I make another statement within a very short amount of time, we'll see how much time, but one statement right after the other, then they become like one statement, right? So, toch kedei dibur, if you say it very close to the other, kid dibur dami, it's like one statement. What does that mean? Right? Again, as we said, if there are two parts of a testimony, but you said them one right after the other, it's as if you made only one statement, even though it's two separate statements. Now, the Gemara says this is actually a machloket. Right? Again, this applies to us, right? If you invalidate one part of the testimony, so then you invalidate the other. That's only if they're connected. But if they're not, so then you don't. So now the Gemara asks, what does it mean that they have to be close together? How close together? So either the time it takes for a student to greet their rabbi, and that would be for you, the time it takes for you to say, Shalom Alecha Rabbi Mori, right? Shalom Alecha Mori, Rabbi Mori. I don't know, about 4 or 5 seconds. Or the time it takes for the rabbi to greet the teacher. This is much shorter, which is Shalom Alecha, right? So again, that's much shorter, but the point is, if you make two statements, we would say together, right? One right after the other. So then we see them as connected. But if not, right, if you make one statement and then you take a drink of water and you breathe a little bit and then you make another statement, those would be two separate statements. Okay. Now, if you thought that was complicated, it gets a little bit more complicated. Now we're going to say, remember, we have two ways to invalidate a testimony, either by contradicting it or by making the witnesses edim zomemim. Okay, it's two different things. So now the Gemara says, if a set of witnesses was at first contradicted, and then they found out that they were edim zomemim, so then they get punished like as if edim zomemim, even though their testimony was thrown out because it was already contradicted. Okay? Meaning, again, someone says it was a gun. And then another set says, what are you talking about? It was a knife. So now, if we believe the second set of witnesses, we should already throw out this testimony. But the Gemara is telling us that if at the beginning it was contradicted, that is the beginning of the hazama process. Meaning, even though it's going to get thrown out, we're already setting up a reality where this set of witnesses can become edim zomimim. Even though we're right, you would say strike that from the record. You would think as soon as I strike it from the record, it doesn't exist anymore. The Gemara says no. As soon as there's contradiction, so now let's wait and see. If another set of witnesses say, what are you talking about? You went to the movies with me on Sunday. Now they become edim zomimim. So it's connected. Okay, so Daf 74 speaks this out and gives quite a complicated story. So I hope I can simplify it. But basically what it's trying to prove is that as soon as witnesses are contradicted, hakasha, it's the beginning of the hazama process. So here's the case. One set of witnesses says that a master knocked out the slave's tooth and then he blinded him. Now, if you remember, we learned that if the master blinds a slave or knocks out his tooth, the slave goes free. So the Gemara tells us that if he knocks out the tooth and then blinds him, the slave goes free, and the master has to pay for the eye, meaning the damage to the eye. Then these witnesses are found to be edim zomamin. So then the witnesses have to pay him the value of the eye. So now, why don't they have to pay the value of the whole slave? Right? Didn't he have to go free? So the Gemara says it shows that both sets of witnesses testified that there was some sort of damage. However, they contradict each other with the order, meaning one set of witnesses says that he knocked out the tooth and then blinded him. Another set of witnesses says, no, he blinded him and then he knocked out his tooth. Right? Either way, we know that there's an injury, which means either way, the master has to set the slave free. And the question is how much he has to pay, either the value of the eye or the value of the tooth. Now, right, let's say the second set of witnesses comes and says, it didn't happen the way you said. It happened, right? So let's say one says it happened on Sunday and the other one says it happened on Monday. So it has to be that the second set has to say that the injury happened before the first set, because we want to say that already when the first set of witnesses said the injury happened, the master was already liable to set his slave free, meaning the injury happened on Sunday and not on Monday. On Monday, that slave was supposed to be free already. And this is why the slave should have been set free, and therefore you don't have to pay for the value, you have to pay for the value of the damage. Maybe this case doesn't prove that contradiction is the beginning of hazama, because maybe both sets admit to injury, right? It's just different types of injury. So maybe it's not really a contradiction, right? It's a contradiction about the details, but not overall what happened. Then we say that there's a machloket if there were 3 sets of witnesses, because we haven't gotten complicated enough. Again, the first set says there was an injury. The second set comes and says, no, you got it all wrong. And then the third set comes and says, what are you talking about? You guys were with us. You don't know what you're talking about. Or maybe there are only 2 sets. Okay, and this kind of simplifies it, right? Meaning the first set says he knocked out the tooth and then he knocked out the eye. A second set of witnesses comes and says, first of all, you don't know what you're talking about. It was the eye and then the tooth, and you were with us at the movies, right? So the same set that comes to contradict also comes and says, you guys are lying because you were with us. Okay, So that, I think, is our complicated portion for the day. The verse teaches that the slave goes free, again, with either the tooth injury or the eye injury. But if it's both, so then you have to compensate for the last injury, meaning the first injury gets him freed. The second injury needs to be compensated for. One set, now again, right, the one set testifies that someone stole and then sold and slaughtered the animal. Then they become zomamin. They pay 4 or 5, right? That's our simple case. And then the Gemara says, but why? As soon as they become zomamin for the theft, it now contradicts the second testimony, right? This proves that the contradiction is the beginning of hazama, right? So that when they become zomamin for the sale, they now pay 4 or 5, right? It goes together. And the Gemara says, no, maybe the case is that they became zomamin for the shchita first, for the slaughtering first. And as we said, not everyone agrees that contradiction is the beginning of hazama. Okay, next Mishnah. And this is the Mishnah that's parallel to the one we started with. If a person stole and there were 2 witnesses, but there's only 1 witness for the fact that he sold the animal, or he comes and admits that he sold the animal, so then he only pays double, right? Again, there are 2 witnesses for the theft. That makes him liable to pay double. If he admits to the selling, he does not have to pay the 4 or 5, meaning the extra 2 or 3. Let's say he stole and sold it on Shabbat, or for idolatry, or he stole the animal from his father. Then the father died, and then he sold the animal, or he stole it, then he sanctified it, and then he sold it. In all of these cases, you pay double for the theft, but you do not pay the 4 or 5, meaning 2 or 3 more, for the sale, because in all of those cases, it's not really a valid sale. Or maybe it depends what kind of sanctity he gives to the animal. If he has responsibility for the animals, he pays 4 or 5, and if not, then he doesn't. Okay, the Gemara explains. Now, we did mention that if you admit to something, you do not pay the penalty. So the Gemara tells us that if you admit to it, it's like having 1 witness. Again, 1 witness is not enough to convict. What does that mean? But that means that if another witness comes, right, 1 plus 1, it will make you liable. So too, if 2 witnesses come after he admits it, so then he is liable to pay. The Gemara says, wait a minute, isn't there an opinion that says that if you admit to the crime, you never pay the penalty, even if witnesses say that you did it? So the Gemara brings a case about Rabban Gamliel, who unfortunately blinds his very favorite slave, Tavi. Tavi is actually mentioned in the Gemara a lot as a very righteous person who knows a lot of the laws. But Rabban Gamliel is happy because this way he's able to free his slave. Again, he is an Eved Knaani, a Canaanite slave, which he's not allowed to set free. But now that he has injured him, I'm assuming by accident, he is allowed to set him free. And therefore he gets very happy. So he goes and he admits what he does. And then Rabbi Yeshua says, wait a minute, if you admit that you did it, he doesn't go free, because if you admit it, you don't get the penalty. And going free is the penalty. So the Gemara discusses that case on Daf 75. Again, as we said, it's a machloket if witnesses come after you admit, if you are liable or exempt to pay. Let's say the case is as follows. a person saw witnesses starting to walk to the Beit Din, right? He saw them, he knows they know what happens. So then he runs to the Beit Din and he says, oh, wait, I have to admit what I did, right? So in that case, right, you pay only the principal, right? And it shows that if there were witnesses, you don't pay even the principal, you don't pay the penalty. The Gemara says, no, maybe those witnesses never showed up, and that's why he didn't have to pay the penalty, right? Or maybe if he sees them coming, so then even if he admits it, he is still liable, because the only reason he admitted it was because he saw that they were coming. So that is extremely it's extremely it's interesting to see what happens. When he admits that he stole, he becomes liable to pay for the principal. And if he says that he didn't steal, so then when the witnesses come, so then he admits to selling it. So then he's liable to pay the penalty because he didn't admit to the principal in the first place. Therefore, he is not exempt from the penalty. We have a Mishnah and a Breita to support that he does not pay the penalty if witnesses come. Okay, as we said, if there are two sets of witnesses, if the shchita set, meaning if the second set of witnesses becomes zomemin, so then the thief pays 2 and the zomemin pay 3. Or another option is that the zomemin pay 2 and the thief pays 3. So the question is, what is the case? The case is that a person is accused of, let's say a person is accused of stealing and he admits and adds, right? He says, yes, I stole. And not only did I steal it, but I also sold it. So then, and then he makes, and he says, right? He says, yes, you're right, I stole it. And you know what? I also sold it. But you know what? You guys have no idea what you're talking about because all 3 of us were at the movies on that day. So I don't know what you're talking about, right? So he makes them so mean. So now he pays double because of there's testimony to this theft, but he doesn't pay 4 or 5 times. Or it's not a good admission because he only admitted it because there were witnesses. Or everyone agrees, right, that this is not a good admission and it's not a regular case. There's a machloket if the testimony that can't become, okay. There are certain testimonies that could never become edim zomemin, meaning if someone says, I saw so-and-so steal a car, but I really can't remember what day it was and what time it was. So now that person can never become an eid zomem because no one can ever say, what are you talking about? You were with us at the movies because I don't know what day it was and I don't know what time it was. So the question is, if that testimony cannot become a zomem testimony, is it seen as a valid testimony or not? So one opinion is no, right? It's not valid testimony, only if the witnesses say, we saw something, but don't remember that day. If you don't remember the date, it's not valid testimony. But if the thief says, I didn't steal anything in front of you, I stole it in front of these other 2 guys, right? So then they can't become zomemin, but it is valid testimony because he's admitting to something, even though they aren't coming to admit it themselves. Okay, Daf 76. As we said, the thief pays the penalty. Sorry, the thief pays the principal, but and the edim zomim pay the double, right? The penalty. Let's say he stole the item, then sanctified it, and then sold it. So then you pay double for stealing it, but you don't pay 4 or 5 times, because when he sold it, it wasn't his that he was selling. He was selling something sanctified. And that for that, you don't pay 4 or 5 times. Maybe the Gemara says, maybe it depends what type of sanctification that it is. Is it sanctified completely to God, which is called Kodshei Kodshim, meaning the highest level of sanctity, where it's going to be burnt completely? Maybe if it was a lesser level of sanctity, maybe there still is a responsibility to pay for it. The Mishnah made a distinction between sanctifying with a responsibility for that item, right? So if you say, I am going to bring this animal as a sacrifice, if that animal dies, you don't have to get another one. But if you say, I'm going to bring a sacrifice, and the animal that you set aside dies, you are responsible to bring another one, because you still have that responsibility. If you have that responsibility, then you still need to pay 4 or 5 for that animal. Let's say a person stole a sanctified animal from someone's house. You do not pay 4 or 5, because it was never his to steal. But if there was responsibility for the animal, then you are liable for it, because you stole it from that person. Okay, now remember we said you steal it, and then you either sell it or you slaughter it. Now, if you slaughter an animal that's sanctified, it's not a proper slaughtering, because you didn't do it in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash. Therefore, how could it be called shchita? Here's another principle. In Hebrew, the principle is shchita she'eino re'uya, right? Slaughtering that isn't a proper slaughtering. Lo shma shchita. It's not called shchita, because it's not properly slaughtered. So therefore, so maybe the case is that he actually took the animal to the temple and slaughtered it. And let's say he did it with in mind to do it for the owner. The Gemara says, wait a minute, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. Take it to the temple and slaughter it for the owner. What's the problem? If it was for the owner, why would you be liable to pay 4 or 5 times? So it must be that the blood of the animal spilled and the owner couldn't get atonement with this animal. Therefore, you didn't do any favors for the owner, and therefore you're liable to pay 4 or 5 times. Or right, maybe the case is that you slaughtered it in the temple, not for the owner, therefore you're liable. Or you slaughtered it outside of the temple because it had a blemish. But it is only valid when the blood is sprinkled, right? A proper sacrifice, you have to slaughter the animal and sprinkle the blood on the altar. It's not the slaughtering that makes it a valid sacrifice, it's the blood. So therefore, right, we say, the case where the animal had a blemish and you slaughtered it outside, maybe the case is that it was redeemed. And even if it wasn't redeemed, it's like it was redeemed. So too with the animal that was slaughtered, it's like the blood was put on the altar, even though it wasn't put on the altar yet. The Gemara gives a case where if something has the ability to do a certain action to it, so it's like it was done, even though it wasn't done. But if there was never enough time for, again, let's say we're talking about sprinkling the blood on the altar. If there was never enough time to sprinkle the blood, so then it's not like it was sprinkled. But if there was time, so it's as if the blood was sprinkled, and therefore it is valid. Okay, with that, we are going to end today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and we will see everyone next week.